Hello, my name is Justin. I am the host of Beekeeping with Disabilities and More, co hosted by Jonathan Bennett, where we tell you about disabilities, overcoming disabilities, and being successful beekeepers. Where we interview those that have already overcome disabilities and have become successful. Remember, be limitless. Here at Beekeeping with Disabilities and More, we believe that it is important to take a look into the history of beekeeping in order to understand where we are today. Today we will be talking about Francois Hubert. Born July 2nd, 1750, he was a Swiss entomologist who specialized in honeybees. His pioneering work was recognized all across Europe and based on observation with the help of two assistants due to his blindness. He had to rely on others to help further his research, in which he hoped to verify honeybee facts and fill in the missing information. His helpers were his wife and his servant, Francois Burnens. In his research, he discovered that the queen bee did not mate in the hive, but mated with drones in the air instead. He further went on to give detailed accounts about how the timing of mating was important to the success of the hive. He verified research that bees are also able to convert eggs into queens by the use of royal jelly, and that worker bees can lay eggs as well. He proved that the antenna of the honeybee is used to communicate. His early research did not stop there. These observations were made using a new hive in which each comb had glass sides. These hives were the ancestors of our modern observation hives. These new hives opened like books with each frame visible to view. This allowed the team to observe the bees and follow them around. The discoveries would not have been possible without the skills and bravery of his servant friend, Francois Burnens, who was fully committed to discovering the truth. The results of these observations were published in an international publication whose title translated to New Observations on Bees in Geneva 1792. The 800-page volume was made from a group of letters that Francois had sent to Charles Bonnet, who happened to be his uncle. It was soon translated into English and then into German. It was well received by the scientific community, not just because of the discoveries, but also because he had overcome such a disability to make a giant stand in a big field. This is just a quick overview of Francois Huber. You can research more on him if you are interested in his story, his observations, and his publications. I would like to thank you for listening to this quick history lesson and look forward to learning, along with you, how we can continue or begin beekeeping should we ever lose our eyesight. Today we have our guest, Ariel Gilbert from Northern California. Thank you for being here, Ariel.
Very excited to be invited.
When I first started looking for people to be on my podcast, one of the first connections that I made was the author of Bee People and the Bugs They Love, Frank Mortimer. The first person that he recommended was you, Ariel. He said that I would love to get to know you and learn about your adaptations and how you have overcome your limitations to be a successful beekeeper.
I've been in contact with him, and we met through a mutual friend, I guess, who's on the same board he's on. And the friend is a guide dog instructor at the Seeing Eye that I've known for years. So it was nice to get connected.
When I first started to look you up before I contacted you, I saw an article on KQED October 2019, which talked about your history in beekeeping.
Yes.
The article went into your history and your background in beekeeping, as well as how you use sound now instead of vision to keep bees.
The senses I have left and focus on the information I can get from those.
Using your heightened senses is a great way to adapt. The first question that we have is, how long have you been a beekeeper?
Well, I'm going to be revealing my age, which is fine with me. I started beekeeping in 1971. So uh, total, it's a little over 50 years with a little gap in there because in 71, I was a junior in high school and I was sighted. And I was sighted until I was 34, which is when I lost my sight. And at that point, I rehomed my 10 hives that I had and thought that beekeeping was not something I could do anymore. At the same time, I was also thinking, I can't do photography anymore. I can't do bird watching, all the things that I thought were sight related. And, over time and learning how to approach things different in a different way to come to this same conclusion that I've been able to regain some of the things in my life that I thought weren't available anymore. I've returned to bird watching a few years after I lost my sight when I recognized that, oh, yeah, birds make sounds and those are that's something I can identify. And lots of times sighted people, the birds are up in a canopy and you can't see them anyway. And if I learn bird songs, I can identify birds. And I can use photography, I can do photography again and still enjoy photography, um, using my iPhone that gives me feedback about what's on the screen and what I'm taking a picture of, and enjoy hearing from other people what I see in the photographs. But it took me a little while to return to beekeeping because I wasn't completely convinced that it was something I could do independently.
Were you not convinced that you could stick your hand into a box of bees with stingers and be comfortable with them?
Well, even more than that, I was concerned about being able to visually assess what's going on inside the hive and make decisions about, you know, space and, what's happening in the hive. And it's been about 7, 8 years ago. A friend of mine who is keeping bees just south of where I live, is out in California, and she wanted to put one of her hives on our property, and I thought, "Wow, this is ideal. I get to have bees or in my environment," and she would be taking care of the hive. And she backed out after a few months. She said, I lost a hive. I don't have enough hives, to be able to move one." So I realized at that moment I was really crushed because I'd always kept an interest in bees and read a lot and loved talking to beekeepers. During that time, I wasn't keeping bees anymore, and realized that I was super disappointed when I wasn't going to have bees on my property. So it made me start rethinking the whole approach to beekeeping. And I fe I started with contacting our county beekeeping association, which is really well developed, the Sonoma County Beekeeping Association, and I contacted them thinking, "Let's see what kind of resistance I get." I mean, that's usually what happens when I wanna do something that isn't, what sighted people think or is, something a blind person can do. And they they were immediately, like, really receptive and said, "Oh, we've got a local group right in your area, and they're having a meeting coming up. Why don't you go?" So I went, and a very experienced beekeeper said, "Hey, I want to be your bee buddy. Let's do this together." And I thought, "Hmm, this looks like it could work." So I got a swarm that she brought me, and we hived it. And one of the things I was thinking about right from the get go, before I even got my bees, was, gee, the way I get information, the way I see is through my fingers. And wearing gloves is like wearing a blindfold. So I decided at that moment that, if I'm going to work bees, I'm going to do it without gloves. I'm going to do it barehanded so I can feel what's going on and not, feel clumsy about what's happening in the hive. And, of course, I had to learn a technique, which was the hard way, which is, got to keep your fingers together because bees are crawling around on your hands. And if you squeeze your fingers together and one happens to be in between, you get stung. So, I learned, I kind of learned stuff as I went, but having somebody who is really experienced be able to look at what's going on in the hive and be able to, talk me through working with my bees really built my confidence. And it's one of those things where, there at times, depending on the time of year, I can do an inspection on my own. I don't need somebody there to visually look at what's going on. But then there are other, certain times of the year, like in the spring, if you're splitting a hive, you need to know, I mean, there's no way for me to feel eggs and,
Yeah.
be able to determine, the age of the eggs and things like that. So, you know, teaming up with somebody who's experienced visually as a beekeeper, it's worked really nicely, teaming up. And but other than the visual feedback that she can give me about the health, the spacing, the bees, the brood nest, everything, um, all the manipulation and working with the bees is something that I do. And I've gotten, obviously over time, gotten more and more comfortable and confident manipulating the hive and working with the bees. And do I get stung? Yeah, I occasionally get stung, but I don't know a beekeeper who doesn't. But over time, I've also, I use sound a lot. Like when I'm in the hive, I use sound to know, okay, I've been in the hive a little too long. They're getting kind of loud and they're giving me the feedback that, they're about done with what I'm doing here. um, and smell is important. I have a good sense of smell. So there's a lot of information you can get from the hive by the smell, whether, there's something going wrong in the hive, the smell will change. Is there mold? Is there a fungal disease or infection going on? Those are things you can smell. There's also the fun part of the taste, which is the honey. That's always been a good, a benefit of working with bees. Um, I haven't created any major just solely blind techniques that are different than what sighted people are doing, except being extremely organized. So if I know I'm going to my hive, anything I potentially think I might need, I have it at my fingertips and I have it organized so that I'm not trying to open up the hive and then have to go running back and forth and move slowly and, expose the bees any longer than I need to. And one thing I do use with sound is a lavalier microphone, one of those little lapel microphones that I hook up to my iPhone. And I put the lavalier microphone because they're designed for sound close rather than sound coming from a distance. I put it on the monitoring board of my hive, and I can then hear the sound of what's going on inside the hive, which is really beneficial in the winter when you can't go in and look at what's going on. You can hear what's going on in the hive and know, okay, yeah, they're sounding good and, calm, and there's good amount of sound going on in there that, I think, I've got a hive that may make it through winter. So those are my, you know, techniques probably that are my major ones that I use that are maybe a little different than other people.
That is an amazing story. Our next question is, how many hives do you currently have?
I currently lost the one hive I had going into winter. I usually like to have 3 hives at one time, and the last few years in Northern California have been really rough on the bee population with, the fires we've had, tons of snow, and drought. It's been a bad combination because it affects the forage for the bees, and then the smoke has definitely affected the bees. So there's been a lot of loss, but prior to the last few years, I usually had 3 hives going at any one time. A swarm trap out, in a couple different locations. I'm hoping that I can catch a swarm, so I have a hive this year. And a couple friends of mine, they may be splitting their hive, and I may be able to get a split. So that's the plan.
Three hives is a lot to manage for anyone. Are all of them Langstroth or something else?
I'm using Langstroth. I'm using mediums, and then where the brood nest is, I use double deeps so that I don't have to have the brood nest split between multiple levels. It's all in one area. And then on top of that, I've got, regular medium frames.
I noticed in your KQED article that you were using a stethoscope in one of your pictures. Is that how you began using your sound?
That's how I started, and then I wasn't really satisfied with the sound that I was hearing inside the hive, and that's when I started experimenting with the lavalier microphone, and they're really inexpensive, like $10, and they work with my iPhone, which is sort of like my Swiss Army knife. Got all my tools that help with accessibility on my iPhone. So yeah, I kind of moved away from the stethoscope concept and went more with the lavalier.
You talked about having a partner with you. Is that something that is necessity when you are doing pest control?
That's where the observation piece of it is really important. I mean, there are some devices for the blind which connect you with volunteers through the camera on your phone or a camera connected to a pair of glasses with a volunteer who's sighted. However, an inexperienced beekeeper volunteer, I wouldn't be able to trust that they knew what they were looking at. So that's why a person lives locally that is experienced, knows what they're looking at, is a good uh, partnership for me. Sort of
Yes.
like with Francois Hubert, who had an assistant, and he used the visual information from the assistant to, you know, do a lot of his experiments.
Speaking of heightened senses, Francois Hubert would have used his other four senses, such as taste, sound, smell, and touch, to use the information that he gained from his assistants accurately.
Right.
Well, I won't go into how you lost your eyesight. I apologize for what you went through, and I wish you the best in your endeavors as a beekeeper. And I am proud of how you have overcome and adapted to all that.
When I was beekeeping in the 70s and 80s, it was a completely different experience than getting back into beekeeping after Varroa and colony collapse. And it definitely, I had a learning curve that I had never experienced losing hives except to the bears um, prior to getting back into beekeeping after losing my sight. So I did have a learning curve to get up to speed on the fragility of bees now compared to how it was beekeeping before.
You definitely answered one of the questions I had. Whenever you said you were beekeeping from back in the '70s, I'm fairly new at it. This is going to be my second year here. Uh, I've heard a lot of people back in the days in '70s and '80s. They say you could go to your hive maybe twice a year or something like that, and keep your bees alive. But that's definitely not the case now. So many people lose their bees due to, like you said, varroa and the different pests we have to deal with now.
Thank you for bringing that up, Jonathan. In the past 50 years, many things have changed with pest control, natural disasters such as the fires in California that Ariel was talking about, and just the temperature changes and how drastic our winters have become. Ariel, this next question is for you. Have you talked to the agriability in your state in California?
I have to admit, I don't know what uh, you're referring to.
Agriability is a nonprofit organization that I think is found in 25 states that puts together groups and engineers to help out disabled people on their homesteads, such as farmers and beekeepers.
Oh, I hadn't even heard about that.
It is a great program. I'm working with the Michigan State and Virginia Tech Agriabilities currently. And what they do is they send an engineer out to your farm or your homestead that assesses your disabilities and comes up with adaptive hardware or ideas on how they can help you continue to be successful. What they do is they either find a state funded program that will help support you in getting your equipment, or they will design and build and fabricate it themselves.
Wow, what a great program.
Well, we will have to check to see if California has one and if we can hook you up with it. Our next question is, do you have any tips or tricks for those with disabilities that are looking to get started into beekeeping?
If somebody wants to get into beekeeping and they're blind or visually impaired, I think reaching out to the local beekeeping community, a beekeeping association, and learning as much about beekeeping and bees before you get started is I mean, I would say that able-bodied person too. Don't get into beekeeping until you've, you know, got a little bit of knowledge and experience behind you. But, for me, I was really impressed with our Sonoma County Beekeeping Association, how inclusive they were. And a lot of people didn't seem too surprised knowing that about Francois Hubert. So it wasn't like, oh no, blind people can't do this. There's already a precedent that there's a blind person who, made huge contributions to knowledge about bees and bee behavior at,
Okay.
from the 1700s.
Francois Hubert was amazing and made amazing grounds.
I was listening to a podcast, a beekeeping podcast the other night about abnormal cell sizes, and that Francois Hubert was actually the first one to point it out, that there are some five-sided cells and seven-sided cells, and how sometimes with space they have to construct odd-sized cells, and he was the first one to observe that.
Frank Linton, another blind beekeeper who's coming on March 30th, has a blog where he did a post about acoustic devices that can help deaf beekeepers. And I was wondering if using voiceover, assuming the app supports accessibility, if it could be used to help blind beekeepers as well. And to find out, I'm interested in sending you the link so that you can research it and get back to me when you have time.
Yeah, I'd be very interested. Thank you.
So now that we've talked about your life, your beekeeping, your use of sound, is there any other tips or tricks that you would like to share?
Not that comes to my mind. Do you have any other questions for me?
This is a question from Jonathan. What kinds of information are you able to gather from the use of your hands?
Oh, that's a good question. I can feel cell sizes, like the difference between drone and worker comb, um, whether comb is sealed. I can feel where the brood nest is. One of the things that I do automatically when I go into a hive, when I first lifted off the feeder box off the top, is just putting my hand over the top of my hive and feeling, and you can feel the heat of where your brood nest is. And that gives me a good idea as I'm going down through my hive where I'm going to find the brood nest. And I mean, it seems really simple, but it's information that's pretty valuable for doing observations and working with your hive.
Some beekeepers will use a queen excluder to limit the movement of the queen to the brood boxes. I'm assuming that finding the queen is something that you need your partner to do.
I don't use a queen excluder. That
Okay.
was something that's a difference between when I was beekeeping as a sighted person. I did used to use a queen excluder, and I don't now. And I use my partner. If she sees the queen, great, but you don't always see the queen, even if you're sighted. But, if you're looking at the laying pattern, looking at the brood nest, you'll get an idea of the viability of your queen. Is the pattern even, or if it's uneven, kind of information is valuable, but you don't always, even if you're sighted, find the queen. But, you just have to be careful that you're not gonna, knock her off. But having the double deeps and having my brood nest in one spot, you have a pretty good idea, where you're gonna find her.
You're right. You do not always find the queen, and looking at the cells for eggs and larvae is another way to determine if she's there or not. Moving on, Jonathan had another question, and he asked the same question I asked him when I introduced him as a co host last week. And that was, what does a typical hive inspection look like for you?
Well, the first thing I'll do is I'll pull out the monitoring board, and, if my partner's there, I'll have her look at the monitoring board and tell me what she sees. If I'm doing an inspection and it's a quick in and out, and I'm doing it on my own, I'll pull the observation board out and take a photograph of it and send it to her. So I'll take multiples just to make sure she can see what's going on. And she's able to look and see, is there exuviae? Are there mites? What does she see on the monitoring board? Is there any mold or, things like that? So that's a visual feedback that I'll usually go with, whether there's somebody there in person or whether I'm doing it with a photograph. And then I'll move to taking off the top of the hive. I'll read all my notes, which I use an app to keep notes on my hives so that how many frames I have, what I found, any information learned about that inspection will go into that app so that I can keep a running idea. But I'll usually review that before I even go into my hive. Depending on the time of year and what's going on with your bees affects how frequently your inspections are. Like in the spring, it's going to be every 10 days, unless you just got a swarm from or a split and you may not have a queen yet. Depending on the situation. But generally in the spring it's every 10 days. And then at least on the West Coast, because we're very dry, we don't get any rain in the summer. By August, then we're concerned about robbing. So, we'll do inspection, but much less frequently. And then we usually get a little bit of rain in the beginning of like September, October, and more forage happens then. So we got a little flourish of forage, and then do inspections, and then usually by the middle to the end of October, I'm setting up my hive to go into winter. Yeah. So making sure I've got enough honey for that hive, and that they're set up, make it through the winter. I don't know. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you answered it beautifully. Thank you so much for telling us about your typical hive inspections and your seasonal changes and the steps you take to overwinter your bees. One question during the talk that Jonathan had that we were unable to answer because Ariel Gilbert did not have her phone on her was, what application did she use? She replied after the interview that she used the B Plus app to keep track of her beekeeping. Ariel had this to say about the accessibility of the app for blind and vision impaired beekeepers.
Accessible. Some of the ones I've tried were not. The buttons weren't labeled, so VoiceOver didn't read them, but the one I'm using worked really well.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that app B Plus with us for sighted and non sighted beekeepers to use with VoiceOver. I believe that is all that we have today. Is there anything else that you can think of, Jonathan?
I don't believe so. I appreciate you coming on and appreciate you having me again this evening, Justin. Uh, we had Castle Highs with us this evening. I don't know how many others we had, but anybody else out there listening, I encourage you to go listen to the stream team here shortly after we get done here. They go live at 7 p.m. Central, I believe.
Yes, it is important to support the stream team and other streamers just like us. Well, Ariel, it was a joy to have you. Thank you so much. We hope you have a blessed beekeeping season coming up.
Thanks for inviting me.
Again, thank you for being here. I know a couple blind people that could be interested in beekeeping and now know that they can be successful through your instruction. I know someone who has recently lost their eyesight who was a sighted beekeeper and now will be able to continue beekeeping thanks to you. One more time, I can't say it enough. Thank you for being here and have a great night, Ariel.
You're welcome. Thanks for talking to me.
Bye.
Bye.
Well, everyone, thank you for listening. This has been Justin Ruger. We had Jonathan Bennett, a co host, and Ariel Gilbert, our guest, talking about beekeeping while blind. Be different, be limitless, and keep on beekeeping.